were statewide and local ballot measures on a wide range of subjects, including taxes, education, crime, and budgetary issues. And some of the measures have received quite a bit of national attention. Joining me today to walk us through the outcome of these ballot measures is Josh Altic, the project director of our ballot measures team, which does fantastic work covering statewide and local measures, in addition to ballot measure related laws and processes. So thank you so much for joining us today, Josh.
Yeah, glad to be here.
So how many ballot measures were decided on Tuesday?
Yeah, so on November 5, voters in 7 states decided 32 different statewide ballot measures. According to the latest results available, we had 17 of them approved, 11 defeated, and then 2 are still too close to call with certainty, although one is leaning towards approved. And then there's one interesting case. Pennsylvania's Marsy's law was approved by voters, but the outcome is still pending a court ruling. There were also hundreds and hundreds of local ballot measures. Ballotpedia covered a selection of 141 local measures throughout 17 different states. So we'll be going over some of the most notable results among those as well.
So there are 2 statewide measures that are still too close to call. Why don't we start there with those measures that have really narrow margins? What can you tell us about them?
Yeah, so unsurprisingly, 3 of the most interesting measures had the narrowest margin election night. So 2 of the measures were in Washington, and they were the only 2 citizen-initiated statewide measures of 2019. That was Initiative 976 and Referendum 88. Enough votes remain uncounted for these measures, since Washington's an all-mail state, that we didn't know the outcome for sure, so we haven't called those. The third one we actually called yesterday, Proposition DD, but it was sort of a nail-biter on election night, and it was approved, but very narrowly.
Now that Colorado measure is related to sports betting in the state, right?
Correct, yeah. So Proposition DD, it was approved by 50.7%. It authorized sports betting in Colorado, and then it allowed the legislature to levy a tax of 10% on those conducting sports betting operations. Most of the estimated 10 to 15 million in annual revenue will go to statewide projects. So Proposition DD needed voter approval under the state's Taxpayer Bill of Rights Amendment, TABOR, in Colorado, and that's not the last time you'll hear me say TABOR in this presentation. So that's why the legislature couldn't just approve it; it had to go to the ballot, since it was designed to implement a new tax. It had a support campaign with about 2.7 million in contributions, according to pre-election reports. The largest donations were from FanDuel and DraftKings, which is not surprising.
And what about the 2 measures in Washington that are still too close to call?
A committee named Coloradans for Climate Justice registered to oppose the measure, but before the election, we didn't actually see any reports of contributions from them. Some might still appear after the election.
Okay, that's interesting about Colorado Proposition DD. It sounds like we may have lost your audio very briefly. But looking to Washington, they're still too close to call. What can you tell us about those?
Yeah, so Washington Referendum 88. Well, just to make sure, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, good. Washington Referendum 88 was essentially an up or down vote on Initiative 1000, and it's still in the air. As of this morning, 51.8% of voters were opposed to Initiative 1000 on that measure. And there were an estimated 620,000 ballots left to count, which is more than 10 times the current margin. So we're not quite calling that one yet. Referendum 88 was the only statewide veto referendum in the country in 2019, and it was one of only 2 citizen-initiated measures, like I mentioned. And what it would do would expressly allow the state to implement affirmative action policies in public employment, public education, and contracting. And it includes a prohibition on the use of preferential treatment or quotas, and adds a definition for those terms into statute, which didn't exist before. Interestingly, the story on this measure actually started back in 1998 with the approval of Initiative 200. Initiative 200 prohibited public institutions in the state from discriminating or granting preferential treatment based on a variety of characteristics. And that initiative did not define preferential treatment, so was restrictive on certain affirmative action policies.
So Referendum 88 is a citizen-initiated measure, which isn't that common this year. Could you tell us a little bit more about what that means and what makes it notable in this case?
Yeah, right. So there were only two, and this one was the only veto referendum, which means that it was put on the ballot through a citizen signature petition seeking to repeal a measure that was recently passed. In this case, it was seeking the repeal of an indirect initiative, which is also uncommon. Most veto referendums target a bill that originated in the legislature. So what happened with this one? Proponents of Initiative 1000 first collected enough signatures that they would reject it through Referendum 88. So you had both proponents and opponents collecting signatures to get this one on the ballot.
That sounds like quite the journey to reach the ballot then. What about the other Washington initiative, I-976?
Yeah, so Initiative 976 was the only ballot initiative, which means sort of a specific kind of citizen initiative measure that proposes a new law rather than targeting the repeal of a recently passed one. It's currently ahead by 55% to 45%, so it's very likely to pass, but that margin is still pretty dwarfed by the number of ballots left to count. So we're not calling that one for sure yet either. It would limit annual license fees for most vehicles to $30, and it would also require vehicle taxes, to be based on the Kelley Blue Book value as opposed to a suggested retail value as it currently is. And then it would repeal the ability for certain regional transit authorities, such as Sound Transit, to impose motor vehicle excise taxes. So there's a big chunk of revenue kind of at stake with this one. The Washington Office of Financial Management estimated that the measure would result in a $1.9 billion reduction in state revenue and a $2.3 billion reduction in local revenue over 6 years. And all of that, most of that, was sort of directed towards transportation. The initiative was sponsored by Tim Eyman, who's a very active initiative filer in Washington. If you're familiar with that state, I'm sure you're familiar with Tim Eyman. And interestingly, there's some developments, sort of aftermath developments this morning. Although the outcome isn't completely certain, we've already had some reactions to its likely approval. King
Josh, it sounds like we lost your audio again. Could you repeat what you were saying about King County, Seattle?
Yeah, I'm so sorry about my audio. So we've had some reactions to the likely approval of Initiative 976. King County, Seattle, and Sound Transit have all announced that they will likely sue in an effort to invalidate the measure. And then Governor Inslee is actually prepared for the approval by asking the Transportation Department to delay any projects that aren't currently ongoing and to pause any non-essential expenses.
So with these ballots in Washington still being counted, when can we expect to get final results on both of these ballot measures?
Oh yeah, good question. So let's see, counties have to certify results by November 26th. And then the Secretary of State has to certify results statewide on December 5. So we'll definitely know by then, but it's likely we'll have a good idea much sooner. In fact, for Initiative 976, since it has kind of that larger margin, we might be able to call that one just after a few more daily results updates. Referendum 88 might take a little longer. But actually, jumping back to Referendum 88 just for a second, we talked about that unique scenario, how it's a referendum targeting an initiative. And I had never actually seen that before. So we looked back at Washington's initiative and referendum history, and it turns out it's happened twice. So there have been 38 total indirect initiatives in Washington before 2019. And 5 of them were approved by the legislature, so they didn't go to the ballot. Of those, veto referendum efforts were launched against 2 of them in 1993 and 1995. So kind of an interesting tidbit there that this is, even though I've never seen it, it's happened twice before.
Yeah, and given that context, it'll be interesting to see how it all actually turns out. So heading to the other side of the country, I saw that over 70% of voters in Pennsylvania were in favor of the Marsy's Law measure in the state, but it's still pending. Why can't we call that one yet?
Yeah, that one's still up in the air because of a court ruling that has nothing to do with election results. It's all about a pre-election challenge to the constitutionality of the measure. So Marsy's Law is a specific set of crime victim rights, and it's backed and largely funded by Henry Nicholas and his Marsy's Law for All Foundation. So while about 74% of voters were in favor of the measure, the results can't be certified and can't even officially be counted and aggregated until that court case is resolved. The preliminary injunction ordering the state to not count results was issued on October 30, and that was appealed. And then that preliminary injunction was upheld by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court on November 4. So we won't actually know what the fate of this one is until that ruling comes down as final.
Is a legal challenge like this an unusual scenario, especially so close to the election?
Yeah, I would say this is a very strange to have this measure in limbo post-election, but this exact same situation happened with a Marsy's Law in Kentucky last year. So in that case, courts ruled that the ballot language for the Kentucky amendment did not sufficiently inform voters, and the amendment was ruled invalid. And that preliminary ruling happened too late to take the measure off the ballot, similar to this Pennsylvania measure. So voters saw it on the ballot and 63% approved it. The measure was then in limbo until 7 months later when the Kentucky Supreme Court gave the final ruling and actually invalidated the measure.
Is that the issue here in Pennsylvania, that the pending case is also about ballot language issues?
No, the lawsuit in Pennsylvania concerns the state's separate vote requirement. So it was filed by the League of Women Voters, the lawsuit, and it contends that the measure actually consists of several separate amendments to the Constitution bundled into one question. Therefore, it would...
Anyone hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear, Josh. Thank you.
And
thank you.
I'm so sorry, everyone.
Yeah, thank you everyone for your patience as we were dealing with those technical issues. We were just in the middle of discussing the legal challenge facing the Marsy's Law measure in Pennsylvania. Could you remind our listeners what the legal challenge in that case was about?
Yeah, so Pennsylvania's measure approved by 74% of voters, but we don't know if it's approved or not because it's pending a legal challenge. So in Pennsylvania's case, the legal challenge regards the state's separate vote requirement. So it was filed by the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania, and it argues that the measure actually consists of multiple separate amendments bundled into one question, and therefore violates the state's requirement that different amendments be voted on separately. So there's a precedent there. Montana's 2016 Marsy's Law amendment was actually struck down post-election for violating the same requirement in that state, a separate vote requirement.
So how have Marsy's Law initiatives fared in other states?
Yeah, Marsy's Law has been kind of one of the successful trends for measures. It's actually never seen a defeat at the ballot, so it's never been rejected. It's been approved in 12 states, but then it was struck down by courts in 2 states, Montana and Kentucky. So far, Henry Nicholas and Marsy's Law for All have funded support campaigns for each measure. So they spent about $100 million across the 12 measures on ballots prior to 2019. And none of the measures have featured well-funded opposition in the past. So Pennsylvania's measure was no exception, and the Marsy's Law for All Foundation spent $6.1 million in support of the measure, which made it the second most expensive measure in 2019.
Wow, $6.1 million. So what measure did have the most expensive campaign this year?
Yeah, so the measure with the most expensive campaigns was in Colorado. It was Colorado Proposition CC, which would have allowed the state to retain revenue that it's currently required to refund to taxpayers under Tabor. So in that case, 54% of voters rejected the measure. At stake was an estimated $310 million in 2019 and $342 million in 2020. That was above the state's revenue cap, according to the state's Tabor amendment. So this measure proposed keeping that revenue and using it for education and transportation, as opposed to refunding it to taxpayers. In that case, the campaign financing was at least more spread out than for Marsy's Law, Support committees raised about 4.45 million, and then opposition committees raised about 1.75 million. And that's according to the most recent reports that covered through October 29. So we could still see, with some post-election reports, those numbers increase a little bit.
And how common are these Tabor-related ballot measures in Colorado?
Yeah, so Tabor was adopted through a citizen initiative in 1992. And since then, Colorado voters have decided 19 different ballot measures that would have increased revenue for the state. In other words, that required voter approval under Tabor. One of them, for example, was concerning marijuana revenue, allowing the state to keep marijuana revenue after marijuana was legalized. That was one of the ones that was approved. So voters have approved 4 of those and rejected 15. So Proposition CC makes that 16 rejected. And it would have pretty comprehensively ended Tabor tax refunds for the indeterminate future.
Well, that's interesting, that connection between Tabor and ballot measures and some ballot measures in Colorado. So Josh, overall, what did ballot measure campaign contributions look like this year? Were there many other campaigns that reached the $1 million mark?
This year actually had low campaign contribution totals as compared to 2017 at least, and even compared to 2015. Ballotpedia tracked a total of 24.7 million in combined support and opposition contributions, and that's for statewide ballot measures this year. In 2017, we tracked 107.8 million, so more than 3 times the amount that we tracked this year, and that was largely due to campaign spending surrounding the 4 citizen-initiated measures in 2017. The most expensive one in 2017 actually spurred more than 75 million in combined support and opposition contributions. That was a drug price measure in Ohio. So yeah, in 2015 we tracked 32 million. So 2017 seemed like an outlier, but 2019 seems low. And keep in mind that these numbers are just for statewide measures. There were actually some local measures that brought in more combined contributions this year than some of the statewide measures. For example, Proposition C in San Francisco.
Yeah, I'm really interested in learning more about what happened in that particular San Francisco ballot measure. Before we do, we've talked about statewide measures in Washington, Colorado, Pennsylvania, but there were also quite a few in Texas this year, right?
Yeah, the 10 constitutional amendments on the ballot in Texas was actually below the average for an odd year in Texas, which is 13 measures. Going into the election, Proposition 4 was getting the most attention. It had the narrowest margin of approval in the state legislature since at least 1995. It tied with some measures in 2005. In the House, it passed by just 1 vote. It got exactly the number of votes it needed to pass in the House, and had maybe a margin of 2 votes in the Senate. At the ballot, it was approved by 75% of voters, so it was more popular there. The measure added a prohibition against an individual income tax to the state constitution. So going into Tuesday, the Constitution of Texas required majority approval in the legislature and then voter approval to enact an income tax. The state currently doesn't have one. So one of the practical changes after Proposition 4's approval is that it now requires a 2/3 vote to even ask voters to consider an income tax, because that's what it takes in the legislature to put an amendment on the ballot. So that increased the threshold required in the legislature to consider an income tax in the future.
So Proposition 4 passed. Did all 10 measures end up passing?
No, Proposition 1 was the only measure to be defeated, but even that surprised me a little bit. The last time voters rejected a proposed amendment in Texas was in 2001. And Proposition 1 passed either unanimously or with very wide margins in the legislature. So to give some context to that, from 1995 through 2018, voters had approved 91% of the 159 total proposed amendments that went before them.
So it sounds like 2019 is right in line with the average approval rate for recent Texas measures, which is about 9 out of 10, like you said. Was there anything else notable about Texas?
Right. Yeah. In the last few decades, 91% is right about where this year was too. Although if you look back further, if you look at all the amendments, there's 677 proposed amendments since the Constitution was first adopted in 1876. So if you look at all of them, the approval rate is actually 74%. It's much higher in the last couple decades. One more measure that kind of stuck out was Proposition 10. It received 94% of the vote at the ballot, which is the highest approval percentage for a Texas amendment since at least 1888, which is as far back as the election records go for Texas. Proposition 10 allows the transfer of a law enforcement animal, such as a dog or a horse, to the animal's handler, and ended up being very popular among voters.
Yeah, it sounds like a little history was made in Texas then with that record high approval percentage for that law enforcement animal measure. So at the beginning of our conversation, you said there were 141 local ballot measures. What stood out to you Tuesday at the local level?
Right, yeah, 141 local measures that Ballotpedia covered. We cover measures in the top 100 largest cities, and then we cover California, and we just expanded to covering North Carolina comprehensively as well. I would say one of the most notable outcomes is question 1 in New York. New York City became the largest jurisdiction to approve the use of ranked choice voting. So New York City question 1 established ranked choice voting to be used for the city's primary and special elections beginning in 2021. So it won't be used for the general election ballot. It allows voters to rank in order of preference up to 5 candidates. Going into the election, Maine was the largest jurisdiction to use ranked choice voting as the only state to employ that particular voting method. Question 1 also contained two other proposals that related to the timing of elections and redistricting for city council districts. I would say the main focus was probably on ranked choice voting, though. It was put on the ballot by a charter revision commission, which also put 4 other questions on the ballot, consisting of 19 different proposals, and all 5 of them were approved.
What about citizen initiatives? We know there were just 2 at the statewide level. Were there any notable ones at the local level?
Yeah, there were quite a few. One of the ones that stuck out was Tucson Proposition 205. It got a lot of national attention. It would have made Tucson the first city in Arizona to enact sanctuary city policies. It ended up being rejected by voters. 71% were against it. The signature petition for the measure that qualified it for the ballot was backed by Tucson Families Free and Together. It was put together by the People's Defense Initiative. Supporters included the Pima County Democrats and the ACLU, and then some statewide opponents came out. Governor Ducey opposed it, U.S. Senator Marsy McSally, Senate candidate Mark Kelly, and then Mayor Rothschild opposed it, as well as Mayor-elect Regina Romero. Voters in Albuquerque also rejected Proposition 2, which it wouldn't have been a first, but a second. Proposition 2 was a citizen initiative that would have made Albuquerque the second city after Seattle to adopt government-dispersed vouchers known as democracy dollars that voters could then contribute to candidates, sort of providing a public campaign finance system. It was a nail-biter on election night as well. It ended up being rejected 51% to 49%, so a pretty narrow margin.
Democracy dollars, that's actually something we've heard a bit about in the 2020 Democratic presidential primary. So it's interesting to see that it also appeared on the ballot this year. Now you've touched on today briefly this San Francisco measure. I believe that measure was related to vaping. Could you tell us how that measure, what happened with that measure on Tuesday?
Yeah, San Francisco Proposition C. It was defeated, which wasn't surprising because Juul actually withdrew its support for the measure at the end of September. Juul was the main backer of the measure. So anyway, it would have overturned portions of a bill passed by the San Francisco Board of Supervisors that banned all vaping products that hadn't been reviewed and approved by the FDA, which is currently all of them, since none have received a pre-market review. It would have also put into question some of the provisions related to flavored e-cigarettes as well. So Prop C would have explicitly authorized vaping and then enacted some regulations concerning vaping products. Juul sponsored the initiative, and they put about $15 million into the campaign. But like I said, in September, they withdrew their support, and the campaign is expected to return much of those campaign funds back to Juul. So the measure didn't end up having any organized support as of near the election. And the opposition ended up raising over $7 million to sort of have a pretty robust campaign against it, and it ended up failing by a pretty large margin.
So I know the 2019 election is less than 48 hours behind us, but are there any interesting 2020 ballot measures coming up on the horizon that we should keep an eye out for?
Yeah, it's never too early to look towards 2020. So far, 42 statewide ballot measures have been certified for the 2020 ballot in 20 different states. And that's just under average at this time of the year for the last few even numbered year cycles. Looking up sort of at elections that are coming up right around the corner, 3 states, Alabama, California, and Maine, all have measures slated for the March 3 ballot. These include a veto referendum concerning the elimination of exemptions for vaccinations in Maine, which is getting a lot of attention. And that issue might appear on the ballot in other states in 2020 as well. We'll also see at least one more Marsy's Law measure in 2020. Wisconsin voters will decide a Marsy's Law of their own on April 7th. November 2020 ballots are still definitely shaping up, although there are some you should keep your eye on. So signatures were recently submitted for marijuana measures in South Dakota, both recreational and medical, and then a marijuana measure in Mississippi. So keep an eye on those measures. And then signatures were also submitted for a Medicaid expansion initiative in Oklahoma. Another potential measure to really look at is an initiative filed by representatives of Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash in California that would define app-based drivers to be independent contractors. And then it would also enact several wage and labor policies for them. That particular initiative was filed in response to California Assembly Bill 5, which defines independent contractors and could require these app-based drivers to be treated as employees, along with all of the rules for full employees, including minimum wage and healthcare, things like that. So yeah, if this initiative ends up on the ballot, it could easily be the most expensive measure in 2020. Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash all provided $30 million each to the campaign. So they definitely have enough money to run a robust campaign, let alone make sure it gets on the ballot.
Well, it sounds like we have a lot to look forward to in 2020, and I imagine we're going to hear quite a bit about that California measure regarding app-based drivers. So thank you to Josh for providing this excellent overview of 2019 ballot measures. Since we had so much material to cover today, we won't be able to respond to some of the questions that we've received. However, we want to make sure that we get you answers. So if you would like, please send in those questions to editor@ballotpedia.org. If you'd like to stay up to date on the ballot measure landscape, please consider subscribing to our free newsletter, State Ballot Measure Monthly, which tracks recent certifications. And of course, please continue to visit ballotpedia.org for updates on the 2019 election results and upcoming 2020 races. You can also stay in the know with all of our general email newsletters, including the Daily Brew, which comes out every weekday, and our weekly newsletter, The Tap. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. Have a great day.